Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. A warm welcome to each and every one of you to another edition of the Unapologetic Muslim. We've got an amazing guest with us tonight, Dr. Khalid El Awaisi. He's joining us all the way from Turkey, and we've got about 40 minutes to an hour of expertise on a very, very important subject and a topic that has been front and center more so for the last year and a half, but it's been lurking in the background for many, many years before that. Before we get into the topic, Dr. Khalid El Awaisi is a graduate of the pioneering field of Islamic Jerusalem studies, where he received his PhD from the University of Aberdeen in 2006. His main specialization is the historical geography of Bayt al-Maqdis, that is Islamic Jerusalem, and the geographical interpretations of the Qur'an. He has taught at a number of Turkish and British universities and was appointed the director of the Center of Islamic Jerusalem Studies in the UK between 2007 and 2011. Currently, Dr. Khalid is working at the Department of Islamic History at the Social Sciences University of Ankara. Warm welcome, Dr. Khalid. Jazakallah khair for joining us. And I'm sure this is going to be an extremely beneficial session for all our viewers and for myself as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think to get us started, our topic centers around Zionism. And we've heard many forms of Zionism and many discussions about Zionism in the media. Take us through what your understanding is. What is Zionism? When did all this begin? Where did all this begin?
Yes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Zionism is an ideology that for the last century has been started as part of the movement for nation states and also putting certain races and creating states for them. So following the French Revolution, this was a disease that spread around the world, and Jewish Zionism was one of the outcomes of this. However, Jewish Zionism, a century before that, Christian Zionism actually was the base that was pushing this forward. And Jewish Zionists took the idea on a century later and were pushing for the idea of creation of a Jewish national home. And the first Zionists, they were mainly secular. Religious Zionism was a later stage. So secular Jewish Zionism was pushing for a creation of a state for the Jews, for the Jewish race, somewhere in the world. And for them, any place was an option at that time. But to get the Jews to accept and adopt the idea, they had to push for Palestine. There was other options within Africa and South America and other places which were actually being discussed, and commissions were sent to these countries to see if these places were suitable. Yet at the end of the day, the concentration around Palestine and creating some Jewish legitimacy over the land was the starting point for the Jewish National Congress in 1897, with Theodore Herzl pushing the idea forward. And from there, for a very long time, after the creation of the state, the Zionist state, Zionism was equal to racism. And this was even acknowledged by the United Nations until negotiations between Arab states and particularly Palestinians and Israel. This was then taken. And this actually, Zionism is equal to racism, to put it in a nutshell.
So this was around, I believe, 1975 when the act was repealed at the UN.
Yes,
with Arab states calling for Zionism to be recognized and equated with racism. If we could just go back a little, you mentioned Theodore Herzl.
Yes.
Where does he fit into Zionism, and why is he a key figure when it comes to the discussion around Zionism?
Yes, Theodore Herzl, his book, The Jewish State, and he's the founder of modern Jewish Zionism. There are roots that date back to well before him, but he's the one that really pushed the idea and institutionalized it and made it acceptable to both Jews and certain Western powers. And he even tried to lobby the Ottoman state to allow the establishment of some autonomy for the Jews in Palestine or in other places within the Ottoman Empire. And he really pushed this forward and tried even to bribe the Caliph or the Sultan Abdul Hamid II into taking this idea forward and allowing the creation of this autonomous state under the Ottomans. So initially this was being pushed as under the Ottoman Empire and paying all its debts and paying the Sultan large amounts of gold in order to give up sovereignty over Palestine. Yet the Sultan paid a very heavy price, his own throne eventually, because of not allowing the Zionists to settle in Palestine or have some autonomy. Not forgetting that actually Jews under the Ottoman state lived nearly in every city in the Ottoman world. And when the Inquisition happened in Spain, when Jews were being chased out of Europe, Muslims welcomed them with open arms to allow them to settle in different cities, from Yemen to the south to Istanbul, in the north, even in the Balkan regions, in Iraq, across the whole of the Muslim world. They were welcomed in North Africa and other places. Yet when this ideology of creating a nation state, the Sultan stood against it. And as I mentioned, in his last letter to his Sheikh Abu Shamat in Damascus, he says the reason he was dethroned was not giving Palestine, making it a national home for Jews. So Theodore Herzl was the key figure in pushing modern Jewish Zionism and trying to make it mainstream within the Jewish communities. However, the religious Jewish community was actually quite against it, and he was secular and using religion for their own ends. And this is something quite interesting, even within modern today's Zionists, Jewish Zionists, secular Jewish Zionists, they will say that God gave us this land, God promised us this land, yet they do not believe in God. And you can see the irony of how this is being used by them. And Theodore Herzl was himself a non-believer, yet when you want, like many Western rulers and governors, they use religion whenever it fits their purpose.
There's something really important that you mentioned. Actually, two things I want to just ask you on. Firstly, there were, according to historical records, Theodore Herzl and the World Zionist Congress, which was formed towards the late 1800s, looked at a number of options besides Palestine in order to settle the Jews who I believe were being persecuted in Europe. So there was a European problem
Yes.
with the Jews. It wasn't a Muslim or Arab issue with the Jews. So if you could just, number one, elaborate on that. And number two, the position of Sultan Abdul Hamid is something that perhaps is not emphasized enough, in that he was in the position of a declining 500-year-old Islamic empire. But yet, I think he taught us a lesson, and he taught the generations thereafter a lesson in terms of standing firm for what you believe in and standing firm for Muslim leaders. Despite everything being disintegrated around you, you hold on to what you believe and your position as a just ruler, because Palestine is waqf, Masjid al-Aqsa is waqf, it belongs to the Ummah, and it is not anybody's to sell off for any amount of money. So if you could just elaborate on those two particular points, please.
Yes. So on the first point, yes, there was a Jewish problem in Europe, and anti-Semitism actually started in Europe. There was no problem, there was no Jewish problem in the Muslim land under the Ottomans or under they lived peacefully side by side to Muslims and Christians and others. And this was a problem of the West, the Jewish problem, as they called it. And they considered, and you see this anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish anti-Semitism, the term is problematic. However, it's been unfortunately used just for the Jews. So anti-Jewish propaganda across the whole of the Western world existed at that time. And as there was problems and the Jews were living in ghettos, and you see all the problem, even within the literature, even if you go as far as Shakespeare, you will see how the Jew was being portrayed. And this wasn't a new problem, even going back to the Crusade. One of the Crusades, when it started in Europe, actually it started getting rid of the Jews in the areas that they were in, and they were massacred in great numbers. And you see the peak of this coming in the Holocaust. But going back even to the 18th century and the 19th century, in the 19th century, the main figures of Christian Zionists were actually also anti-Jewish. They were against the Jews having the right to vote in the UK, for example. Yet they wanted to export this problem and send them off to Palestine. So the Jews didn't have a problem living in the Muslim land for centuries, from the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab in Bayt al-Maqdis, in the Holy Land, all the way to the rise of Zionism. They were welcome to live wherever they wished under Muslim rule, and they were not treated, as some Orientalists try to claim, as second-class citizens. Even in the Abbasid period, they reached a level within even the Fatimid Egypt, within Abbasid Baghdad, across the whole of the Muslim world. They held very high positions within the state. And in one of the poems of one very famous poet, he says, if you want to get something done, if you're a Jew, you'll be able to access everything, and you'll be able. This is under Muslim rule. Exactly the opposite you see in the West, in the Western world, in Europe. The Jews were being chased out. They were seen as the other. They were expelled from so many different places across Europe and further afield. On the second point, on Sultan Abdul Hamid, Sultan Abdul Hamid saw clearly Zionism as a threat to both Islam, to the Muslims and to the Jews living under the Muslim state. Even before Sultan Abdul Hamid, if we go back to 1799, when Napoleon tried to occupy the Holy Land, he issued a proclamation calling upon the Jews of Asia and Africa to come under his banner, and he will re-establish ancient Jerusalem for them. This is coming out after the French Revolution, where the state and the church were to be separated. Napoleon comes into Egypt and declares himself as a Muslim in order to win the sympathy of the Muslims on one side. He comes to Palestine, he tries to get the Jews on board, and the response of the Jews living in Palestine and in Asia and Africa, they did not heed to his call. They were happy living under the Ottomans, and the main Jazar Ahmed Pasha, the governor of Acre, his first-hand man was actually a Jew, and he led the resistance against the French invasion of Palestine alongside Muslims and others. So you can see the contrast in this. Coming back to Sultan Abdul Hamid, Sultan Abdul Hamid saw Bayt al-Maqdis, saw Palestine. Even in his letter that I mentioned, he clearly calls it the Holy Land, the land of Palestine. And he saw the threat that this could cause and stood against it firmly. With everything, as you mentioned, the Ottoman state was in decline. It was in a very difficult position. There was a lot of debts that had to be paid. And the generous offer that he was presented to clear all the Ottoman debts, and on top of that, he'll get so much gold to live in peace. He refused that offer, and he said Palestine is a land the Muslims had took with blood, and there is not an inch of this land he's willing to give up, which is exactly the position every Muslim needs to hold on the issue of Palestine and on the issue of Bayt al-Maqdis and al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And we saw immediately after he stopped the migration of Jews into Palestine, and he put a lot of restrictions, yet he allowed them to come and visit on pilgrimage. He didn't stop that side of it, and he issued what was known as the red passports, allowing them for a stay for a couple of months and then having to leave. Immediately after he was dethroned, the Young Turks, or the Ittihad and Taraqi, immediately opened the door, and they were the reason that he was dethroned. And this was part of Turkish nationalism that was being pushed forward, and the alliances they had with Western powers immediately revoked his restrictions on Jewish migration into Palestine, particularly the Zionists, and numbers started to increase immediately after he was dethroned.
And then obviously we reflect on some of the statements that were made in the British Parliament at the time, leading up to 1924, with the dissolution of the Ottoman Khilafah.
Yes.
In that the strength of the Muslims, I think it was Lord Curzon who mentioned this in the British Parliament, the strength of the Muslims lies in her Islamic state, or in her unity, and once that's dissolved, we must make sure that it never stands again, that they never come back together again. And since then, obviously, we've had nation states, and we've had Muslims going at each other on the basis of nationalism ever since.
Yes,
Dr. Khalid,
on this point very quickly, when the British occupied Istanbul at the beginning of the 20th century, this was one of the main conditions that although it was at that time it was symbolic, the issue of the Khilafah, yet we need to dismantle it. And in March 1924, as part of the newly formed Turkish Republic, this unity, symbolic unity at the time with the Muslims, had to be dismantled, and Muslims were then divided along lines that were drawn by the British and the French, creating new identities that never existed. And then nation states and your nationality comes above everything else. And Lawrence of Arabia talked about this clearly in his book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, in which he talked about that we need to turn the Muslims away from Allah and Mecca, their Qibla being Mecca, towards nationalism, and particularly Arab nationalism in Damascus. And you can see how they succeeded in dividing. Today we're talking about 57 Muslim states, and none of them are able to, for the last 70 days, take a glass of water into Gaza, and people are dying out of hunger, a shame that will be carried by every Muslim around the globe.
And this is such a crucial point, because in number we are in excess of 2 billion around the world, across 57 Muslim states, and then Muslim spread amongst non-Muslim nations as well. But the one thing that's keeping us apart from each other, in fact, it's causing us to go to war with each other at times, is this disease which the Prophet ﷺ referred to as asabiyah.
Yes.
And he ordered us in hadith to leave it because it is rotten.
Yes. And I think this is one of the worst things that happened to the Muslim Ummah today, is this division alongside identities and superficial identities. You talk about someone being Jordanian, being this identity being drawn by the ruler, by the British. And you see this across the whole of the Muslim world, people taking pride in this rotten identity, as you have mentioned in the hadith of Rasulullah. And Allah says in the Qur'an, this is your ummah, one ummah, and I'm your Lord, worship me. Yet we prefer the words of the colonizers to the words of Allah today.
That is indeed a sad indictment on all of us,
Yes.
on Muslims around the world. And it's something that is critical, I think, for us to evaluate and reevaluate in terms of our position, because the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ with regards to nationalism are very, very stark and very severe in their warning, in terms of dying for the flag of asabiyah. That's not a death anybody should wish for, because it's either you are shaheed for Allah's sake, or you are shaheed for nationalism, and that's not something anybody should be proud of. Just to digress shortly, the recent situation we had in the escalation between India and Pakistan. We had Muslims in India, the head of Jamiatul Ulama Hind, who came out with the most atrocious statement. I'm sure you've seen that it's a duty for the Muslims of India to defend our borders, and we must make sure that the borders are so strong that even if Jibreel wanted to come here, he wouldn't be able to enter. Wow.
It is really, really sad to see the situation of the Ummah in such a state. And this reminds me of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he described our situation 1400 years ago, in which he says, nations will snatch at you like they're inviting each other for a meal. And you see this with the situation of the Muslims in eastern Turkestan, the Uyghur Muslims in Kashmir, to the west, to Sudan, to Yemen. And you see across this division, the colonialist powers have succeeded in creating these new identities, and we adopted them to the level that these become the flags, the borders, everything that is being drawn becomes, again, and it's very harsh to say, but it has to be said, it becomes holier to us than the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the words of his Prophet who we claim to be following. He says, leave it, it stinks, it's rotten. Yet the colonizers have made it for us that we cannot break away from this. And the only future for the Ummah is to break away from all of this. We see today the death of nation states, and this is the golden time to be able to come up with an alternative to the world system. We see the failure of this international system, the courts, the United Nations. All of this is failing, and it is time that the Muslims come up to the responsibility of the leadership of humanity once again. We once led humanity, and today we are at the bottom of human civilization due to us adopting these systems that were imposed on us by the West, but we have glorified them to the extent that they have become our new framework.
This is something I think I'd like to touch on with you, inshallah, towards the end of the interview when we're looking at potentially a way forward, because this is something absolutely critical that you mentioned. Just going back to Zionism, so Zionism was formed in Europe in the late 1800s. Is there a connection between Judaism and Zionism, if at all? Was Zionism a feature in the practice of the Jews in Palestine before the export of the Europeans into Palestine from as a result of what was taking place in Europe and the persecution they were facing? Was Zionism a feature in their religion in any way, shape, or form, and if so, how? Or was Zionism something completely alien to them? And then we can possibly look at what are the components of Zionism, or what are the main features of Zionism.
Yes. Until the arrival of the British in 1917 in Palestine, Jews who were living in Palestine were generally anti-Zionist. And you actually see this not just in Palestine, but across the whole of the Muslim world. And the Zionists, for example, one striking example is the Jews who were living in Iraq, or the Jews who were living in Yemen, or living across the whole of the Muslim world. And one example that comes from Iraq is Zionists would go into the places where the Jews were living in these places and try to force them to leave towards the new Zionist state that has been established. And they would go as far as bombing their synagogues and blaming it on the Muslims and hatred of the Jews. The Jews who were living in Palestine were living mainly in the north of Palestine. There was very little Jews who settled around Jerusalem or al-Quds or Bayt al-Maqdis due to religious reasons, that they could not return to this land until the arrival of the Messiah. And a lot of religious Jews saw Zionism as blasphemy, and they saw this as against the will of God, and this is something that should not be practiced. Still today there are some groups who still hold this idea, yet after the establishment of the Zionist state in Palestine, a lot of Jews adopted the idea, but until then actually they were living with the Muslims, with the Christians, peacefully, with a few exceptions. So, for example, in 1840, the Jews and the Christians in Damascus had certain conflicts, that they were blaming each other for certain things, and there was a lot of killing between them. And the Ottoman state resolved that. And you can see always Islam was even resolving conflicts between not just Muslims and others, but even with between different religions. And one amazing example you see under Ottoman Palestine is they had this, what they called the millet system. So each religion would be governed by its own laws, religious laws, and they had their courts. And if you were not satisfied, you can then take it to the Supreme Court, to the Islamic court. And you saw an example of a Jewish woman who went to the Jewish court in Jerusalem and requested certain rights that she had, and the rabbi would not give it to her, and she threatened him, and this is documented in the Ottoman archive. She threatened that she will take it to the Islamic court, and then he gave her her rights. They were living without this Zionist disease amongst the Muslims across the whole of the Muslim world, and in Palestine in particular. They cherished, and they were living peacefully. They had their businesses, they had their trade, they had certain work that they would do, and they would not be interfered by. And you can see a lot of the cities in Palestine where Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the Ottomans did census on the population in every number of years, and you can see the numbers, and you can see how they have lived side by side. So Zionism was a disease that later entered amongst some of the Jews, but it was not adopted until the state was established, and they were forced into this new ideology, whether they liked it or not. And this is why you still have certain groups living in Palestine who are actually anti-Zionist Jews still living there in Jerusalem. But one starking example is in Nablus, the Samira Jews, and they see themselves as the true Jews, and they're not even accepted by the Zionist state, and they live amongst Palestinians, and they're part of the resistance. And in the recent exchange of prisoners, I met one of the prisoners, and he told me as part of the resistance, we had Samarite Jews who were actually part of the resistance against the occupation. You had Christians and you had Muslims fighting hand in hand against this Zionist occupation of Palestine. So to answer the question, they were not Zionists until the British occupied, and then larger numbers started coming from Europe well before the Holocaust. And they tried to say the Holocaust was the reason, but actually even something that Zionists tried to smear and don't want anyone to talk about is the alliance between Zionism and Hitler in order to get rid of the Jews from Germany. And when Ken Livingstone, the mayor of London, talked about this and published an article with evidence of this, there was a massive smear campaign against him, and he had to leave his post as mayor of London. And you can see the way that they try to control the narrative, and the way they try to present this new Zionist ideology as a natural progression for Jewish identity, and they push it down the throat of Jews, whether they liked it or not. And the example I gave in bombing synagogues in Iraq, to forcing Yemeni Jews to leave, to Kurdish Jews, to others, the way this was systematically done after the creation of the state in 1948 becomes very clear how they were forcing Jews to accept this new ideology. And this is their only solution. Israel is your only solution, is your only savior. And when there was an attack on a synagogue in France, Netanyahu, when he went there, he called upon the Jews of France to come and to move to Israel. This is their only safe haven. There is nowhere safe for the Jews. So this is the propaganda they try to push. And this is still being pushed by Zionists today. Yet you see, particularly after the flood of Al-Aqsa, after the 7th of October, how this has turned against them. And a lot of them are leaving this Zionist state in large numbers, in their hundreds of thousands, because they do not feel safe in what has been created, in the monster that has been created in Palestine.
That's quite amazing, because we often refer to them these days as false flags operations. Yes. where the attacks are carried out and then blamed on somebody else, in most cases Muslims. However, here we had probably the proponents, the originators of false flag operations being the Zionists, in order to drive Jews from neighboring Iraq and Yemen and everywhere else. And this is quite telling, because you hear Israeli propagandists very, very often pushing back on the argument that Jews were being persecuted all over the Middle East, and they all immigrated willingly to the so-called new Zionist state because that's where they felt safe. This idea of Jewish statehood and safety, which leads me on to the next question. What are some of the key principles or pillars of Zionism?
Yes, the main pillars that Zionism is based upon is creating this new identity of Jews and trying to give them some legitimacy. So creating this state identity, and they pushed it together with the idea of immigration or aliyah, and pushing this down across all places where Jews lived. So creating this distinct Jewish national identity, something that did not exist. The Jews have assimilated in the cultures that they were in. So you look at Yemeni Jews, actually their food, their music, their culture is all Yemeni. You will see this with Iraqi Jews. And Avi Shlem, the Oxford professor, he talks about this, that they spoke at home Arabic. And you see this also amongst Kurdish Jews, the way they would dress, the way they would speak, all of this, they had assimilated into these cultures. But what what was being pushed forward is the creation of this Jewish national identity, and creating also Hebrew as the common language. Most of these Jews did not speak Hebrew, and ancient Hebrew had ceased to exist. So with the creation of the state, they based actually modern Hebrew on Arabic. All the grammar, everything was based on, and you will see a lot of similarities in the words and the language. And they tried to make this connection with this land, the land of Palestine, and create it as the land of Israel, and create this connection that this is the land that you need to return to. This is your inheritance. This is the land that God promised you. And many of them who were secular, this was nonsense. However, they were pushing this particularly with the layman Jew. And the third issue, as I mentioned, is aliyah, or Jewish immigration to Israel, encouraging Jews from across the world, wherever they are, to migrate to Israel, and saying this is the only place for them. And this is where they will have self-determination and political sovereignty, something that they've not had for over 2,000 years. One last thing that is the main pillar of this, the Zionist ideology, is Jerusalem as its capital, and pushing that Jerusalem, united Jerusalem, is the eternal capital, not of Israel, but of the Jewish people. And you heard Trump in his last term repeating this propaganda that Jerusalem, united Jerusalem, will be the eternal capital, not of Israel alone, but of the Jewish people. And these were the main pillars of Jewish Zionism in the modern sense.
We probably seeing today, and I suppose this is something that we can review and go through history to kind of double check, but the Israeli government today is probably the most right-wing that we have seen, especially in our lifetime, potentially even before that. And when you've got criminals, war criminals inside of the government, you've got the prime minister who's wanted on war crimes charges by the ICC, you've got people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich who are openly declaring war crimes in parliament, in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, calling on the expulsion of Palestinians, calling on the killing of Palestinians. What role has Zionism taken, and what shape has it taken within the Israeli government, and where is that on the scale of what had happened before and what had preceded before? Because there have been land grabs before. There have been murders before of Palestinians. There have been expulsions of Palestinians before. Where are we at right now with this current Israeli government?
Yes, you're correct that this is the most right-wing government Israel has seen. And this is with the rise of religious Zionism. Religious Zionism at the start was not a player in the creation of the state. It was mainly secular Zionism. And you have these two identities in the current modern state, where you have secular Zionists who were the founders of the state, even going back to David Ben Gurion and others. They were mostly secular. And even when Israel took Eastern Jerusalem in 1967, the chief rabbi of the army, or the rabbi of the army, asked for the destruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the generals, the secular generals, they said, "You're crazy. If you keep pushing this forward, this is not something that they were hoping for." However, they created, since the start of the British occupation, they tried to create a national and religious symbol, both together. And this became Al-Buraq Wall, the western wall of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And this was the starting point for their attachment with, by the end of the Ottoman period, this started to develop, particularly at the time of the governor of Egypt in 1830 and 1840, who occupied Palestine for 10 years. And he allowed the Jews for the first time to come to Al-Buraq Wall and start to, he legitimized their worshipping there. But during 1948 till 1967, no Jews were allowed there, because this was under the Jordanian control, because they had expelled the Arabs from Western Jerusalem, and they did the same, and the Jews that were living in the old city were forced out, and this created a longing for Jerusalem, and this becomes then the symbol for both the Jewish secular and religious fronts. But from 1967, from 1948, 1967, and you see the religious Zionism was relatively not strong within the state. And this starts to rise. Even talking about the temple was a taboo in Israeli society, until the year 2000, when Ariel Sharon stormed into al-Masjid al-Aqsa with thousands of soldiers, sparking the second al-Aqsa Intifada, the second Intifada, al-Aqsa Intifada. And this then led to the rise of these factions within Israeli society. And then the issue of the temple starts to become the main discussion along a lot of these groups, coming all the way to the representation. So after the year 2000, the representation within the Israeli Knesset, the right wing and religious Zionism starts to increase. And now they are in full control, not just of the Knesset, but also of the army, of the judiciary, of everything within the state. And you see, they do not see themselves as secular Zionists, saw themselves as an extension of the West. They see themselves as the rightful owners of this place, and they push this narrative. And this is why the examples that you quoted of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu, quoting even Netanyahu, quoting the Amalek, a religious text, quoting them that kill every child, woman, animal, don't leave anything. You can see how this is rising, and this is becoming the norm within Israeli society, and this is being pushed. Still, Israeli society is divided amongst secular lines and the left wing on one side, and then you have now the religious Zionists who are in full control of the state, and what they are doing is exceeding what was done between 1947 and 1949 in the Nakba. 500 villages and cities were ethnically cleansed of Palestinians. Now what they're pushing forward, they're pushing this with a religious narrative, and they're calling for the killing of every child, woman, man, everyone. They have no right in this, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And already there's not a lot of light being shed on what is happening in the West Bank and how they are weaponizing the settlers, giving them guns, attacking Palestinians, and issuing decrees that you need to leave this land. And eventually, the goal of this government and the ministers within this government is the expulsion of every Palestinian. Israeli citizens within the 1948 land, Arab Palestinians, to the Palestinians in the West Bank, to the Palestinians in Gaza. There should be, and this ideology even goes beyond that. You heard Smotrich talking about Damascus being part of this Jewish state, and this concept of the promised land extending to include southeast Turkey, northern Arabia, parts of Iraq, all of Syria and Jordan, parts of Egypt. They're not now, they used to feel shy talking about this, and they would keep it disguised, a lot of this. But you saw this clearly in the past, in, for example, the coins that were minted having the map of Greater Israel, what they called Greater Israel, extending from the Nile to the Euphrates. But now they're going beyond this and talking about this openly. So the issue of the promised land is no longer a taboo. The issue of expelling Palestinians is no longer a taboo in Israeli society. The issue of creating a temple over the site of al-Masjid al-Aqsa is something that is openly talked about amongst ministers, not just amongst lay people or religious Zionists.
Now, this ideology has extremely strong support. It has powerful support, especially in the United States, where there's been an emergence of something called Christian Zionism, which is very, very entrenched in political circles within the United States and within the government. You see that within the Congress, and you see prayers taking place, and despite elements of Judaism and Zionism openly criticizing religious figures within Christianity. How did all of this come about, Christian Zionism? What happened and where did this emanate from? Because elements of Talmudic teachings are completely at odds with Christianity. And some of the things they say about Maryam, it's not something you can repeat. Some of the things they say about Isa alayhi salam, it's not some of the things that you can repeat. So how did this happen, this unholy alliance, if we can call it that?
Yes, it is an unholy alliance, and it goes back, as we started with, Jewish Zionism or Jewish national aspiration started in the late 1800s, 1897. It became institutionalized. But going back to the beginning of the 19th century to the early 1800s, this is when Christian Zionism in the United Kingdom, in Britain, becomes institutionalized and becomes part of the idea that we need to send the Jews to Palestine, get rid of the Jewish problem. All of this is fitting within this second coming of the Messiah. So for the arrival of the Messiah to take place, and this has its root in Protestant Christianity, going back to Martin Luther, it has various different discussions that took place well before the 19th century. Yet it became institutionalized in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s. And this followed 1799, when Napoleon, as I mentioned, called upon the Jews to come under his banner. The British, particularly the evangelical side, the Christian Zionists, took this idea and started working towards it. And the first step was to Christianize the Jewish population and then send them off to Palestine. This project failed because not many Jews, with a few exceptions, adopted Christianity. So they then shelved this idea, and they said, when the Messiah comes, he will deal with them. Then you have figures. I will mention a few important figures, but then you have the London Society for promoting Christianity amongst the Jews, and then this becomes the London Jewish Society, and then this becomes the main lobbying body in Britain, trying to convince the government to push for the idea of sending the Jews to Palestine. And it succeeded in creating the first British or the first Western consulate in Jerusalem in 1837. And the first consul general was from this group, from the Christian Zionists. So was the second, and they had a lot of influence. And what they were pushing forward is that we need to move the Jews to Palestine. And they were trying to convince the Jews in Britain to do this. And even the consul, the British consul general in Damascus, he wrote to many prominent Jewish figures that we are trying to do something for you and you're not buying into the idea. We are pushing for the idea that you need to move to your homeland, but they were doing it for ulterior motives. As I mentioned, Shaftesbury and Palmerston were the main figures in the 1830s, 1840s. One becomes the Prime Minister of Britain, and the other was in the House of Lords. And like today, Trump and Kushner are connected through mother and daughter. Exactly the same existed at that time. And he pushed Palmerston, and this was the creation of the first Western embassy in Jerusalem under Muhammad Ali Pasha, and then this develops because the British had no foothold in Palestine. The French had some influence over the Catholics. The Russians had some influence over the Orthodox. The British, there was no Protestant community in Palestine. So they were pushing this idea that they become the influence they will create was through the Jewish community in Palestine. And they extended to them that they are part of the British Empire. Yet a lot of discussion took place in British media at that time. The religious aspect was being pushed among certain circles, but the idea that we need to create a buffer state at the heart of the Muslim world, meaning here Palestine, for British interest with trade with India, for British colonial interests across the world, for its geopolitical importance. And they were selling this in the British media across the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, until then you had Jewish Zionism later in the late 1890s developing. And then you saw the Balfour Declaration wasn't addressed to the Jewish community in Britain, but it was addressed to the Zionists, those who were pushing this idea, like the Rothschild and others. So this was particularly during the First World War, was one of the main things that were being pushed forward. The idea that we need to, in order to control the region, we need to create this buffer state. And the Jews were used as pawns in this idea. And you saw this being reflected after the 7th of October. You had Herzog, the president of the Zionist state, talking about this being a war between Western civilization and barbarism, meaning the Muslims on one side. You had Netanyahu talking about this as being the frontier of the West in the region. They saw themselves as part of this Western project. So this was part of this Western colonial project for this land. Yet it had this religious element. And the religious element, if you allow me to talk about the main pillars of it, one is we need to move the Jews to Palestine for the second coming of the Messiah. The second level of it is we need to create a state for them. The third level of it is Jerusalem has to be its capital. And you saw how this has developed over a century. The last point in which Christian Zionists today push in their media is the creation of a temple over the site of al-Masjid al-Aqsa. This is the last leg in the Christian Zionist project. And in 1967, when Israel occupied Al-Aqsa Mosque in June 1967, a Christian, a very prominent Christian figure in the United States, talked about a prophecy that the Messiah will come within 4 years. This drove a Christian Zionist from Australia to come to Jerusalem and set fire to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Because for the Messiah to come, we need to destroy Al-Aqsa and build the temple. And you saw this. Jewish Zionists were actually believing that the temple will be created, but it is through divine intervention. We should not do anything. It is God that will build the temple. Then you have reformist Jewish Zionists who are saying, no, we need to do the groundwork. We need to do all the legwork. And then we need to prepare everything. And you have this within religious Zionism, and Ben Gvir is part of this particular group. Going back to Christian Zionists, you see their influence, as you have mentioned, in the United States is very strong. A lot of the people that Trump is surrounded with are in his last term and in the current term are all Christian, hardcore Christian Zionists. And they talk openly. Even the terminology used by the ambassador is Judea and Samaria. They're not willing, they're moving away from terms like the West Bank and so on. And you can see this, the way they talk about the temple during the deal of the century. The area of al-Masjid al-Aqsa was referred to as Temple Mount. This should be open to all faiths to pray. So making the masjid, and since then al-Aqsa has been going from the Muslims are losing control over al-Aqsa Mosque, temporal and spatial, in a spatial sense. The temporal, you see the division in time, and this prior to the deal of the century, Jews would enter al-Masjid al-Aqsa only as tourists. Now they are allowed to conduct their rituals. And just yesterday, someone even took a sacrifice inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa and tried to sacrifice it within al-Aqsa Mosque. You see their prostrations, you see them doing religious sermons within, reading from the Torah within al-Aqsa Mosque, exactly as has started at al-Buraq Wall at the beginning of the British. They do it gradually. It's a step-by-step, and yesterday's entry and trying to make a sacrifice within al-Aqsa Mosque is part of this. It should not be read away from this. Christian Zionists on the issue of the temple have even genetically modified what they call these red heifers, and they have shipped them off from Texas. So Christian Zionists are active in preparing for the destruction of al-Aqsa. You watch their TV channels, they're raising money. Actually, Stephen Sizer, who is a prominent specialist in Christian Zionism, and his book is excellent. He talked about, out of every 10 Zionists in the world today, 9 of them are Christian Zionists. The majority of Zionists today are Christian Zionists, and they're pushing this idea. This is the final stage before the arrival of the Messiah, and this is why it's very dangerous. And the Tufan of al-Aqsa, part of it was in defense of, even the naming of it, the resistance in Palestine named it the flood of al-Aqsa because of the threats that were being, the threat of losing al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And you see this threat developing every single day in a gradual step. Today, while the Zionists roam al-Aqsa, the Muslim guards are not allowed to be there. They're not allowed to film them, and they're allowed to conduct their rituals within al-Masjid al-Aqsa, something that was not allowed prior to this. So you can see how this is developing stage by stage. Thus, Christian Zionism, and you saw both the defense minister and also the foreign minister, and their clear Zionist, one drawing the cross on top of his head, and the other one having the Jerusalem, the kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem tattooed on his chest, and even having the word kafir written in Arabic on his hand. So you can see how this Christian Zionist ideology, this evangelical ideology in the United States today is stronger than anything else. And most of the people within the Trump government, unfortunately, prescribe to this ideology. And his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is a Jewish Zionist, and he's the mastermind behind the deal of the century. And you saw pictures today of he's the one that started the relationship with MBS in Saudi Arabia. And you saw today the way Trump was welcomed in in Saudi Arabia and gathering $600 billion coming up to $1 trillion from these Gulf states. Jared Kushner is one, David Friedman, Stephen Miller, Ivanka Trump. You look at his ministers today, his ambassador is part of this, his previous ambassador and the current ambassador are both part of this Christian Zionist, and this ideology is extremely dangerous. They want to force the hand of God, as they claim, for Armageddon. They want World War III. They strive towards this, and you saw elements of this in the past. It has never been this strong within the American government, and you see a reflection of this within the Israeli government, and the way Ben-Gvir was welcomed, and the way he justified what he's doing to Palestinian prisoners, and the way they were dealing with Gaza, and you see the full support. Anyone who would speak against Israel, even within academia, you see how they're silencing voices across the board.
They literally, the United States is in the hand of religious fanatics. Israel is in the hand of religious fanatics, and it points us in a direction that, as you say, they want to force the hand of Allah, which is not going to be something that would be favorable to them. But you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and that leads me to a next question. Some commentators and some activists have referred to Muslim states who either actively support the apartheid state, like the UAE, or collude with Israel and America, Egypt, Jordan, for example, or others who turn a completely blind eye to the atrocities that are being carried out. These are being referred to as Muslim Zionists. Is this, in your view, a valid description? And if so, why do you think so?
Yes, unfortunately, we have lots of Muslim Zionists today across the states, and you have examples of them in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain, and even in Jordan, in Egypt, in Morocco, across the Muslim world, and they subscribe to the Zionist ideology. And you have heard these Zionist voices on Egyptian TV, on Saudi TV, on Kuwaiti TV, and yet the term, you cannot be a Zionist and a Muslim. It doesn't fit together. It's impossible. And this brings me into something really, really beautiful I heard from a Turkish professor. He says, this transgresses from our discussion, but it's important to say. He says, no Muslim can be anti-Semitic, but every Muslim has to be anti-Zionist. It is so technically you cannot have a Muslim and a Zionist. Someone who subscribes to the beliefs of Iman and Islam cannot be a Zionist, because it is against the framework of Islam. Yet you have what we would call munafiqeen, in hypocrites in the Quranic terminology, and you have a lot of them. They existed from the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and exist today. And most of, unfortunately, the Arab leaders, and to a large extent the Muslim leaders, are from this category. And you see how blatantly they stand against, and they would fight against Islam wherever it may be. And these are so-called Muslim leaders. Yet, I will give a few examples of this. One is Yusuf Zidan in Egypt, very prominent literary individual, very famous. He repeats Zionist propaganda in Arabic for Arabic audience. And one of them is he repeats the work of Mordechai Kidar, Zionist professor at Bar Ilan University, who says Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem was never important to Muslims. It is never mentioned in the Qur'an. It is this, it is. So he repeats the same propaganda on Egyptian TV. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ never went to Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, in Palestine. He went somewhere else. And this Zionist professor takes a text from Al-Waqidi out of context, and he tries to say Al-Aqsa is somewhere outside Mecca. And you have someone with the name or Muslim name repeating this on Egyptian TV. You see the clear example of this. The same in a Saudi Arabian newspaper, famous newspaper, Uqad, someone exactly repeating exactly these same ideas without alternation, without making even adjustment to them, repeating them, just putting his name on top of this. On Al-Watan TV in Kuwait, I heard a guy saying, Allah promised this land to the Jews. And then you had social influencers, social media influencers, like Muhammad Saud, who went to Palestine, met with Netanyahu, and then he went to Al-Aqsa. And the people there spat on his face. You Zionists, get out of this holy place. You are no different from the Zionists that you came to visit. You had Emiratis coming and Bahrainis coming and joining the Jewish prayer at Al-Buraq wall, part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and even facing Al-Buraq wall, not facing Mecca, while the Bahraini was making his Muslim prayer. So you see these clear examples of these Zionist munafiqeen amongst the Muslims trying to say, well, we have exactly repeating Zionist propaganda. And Eddie Cohen says they are more Zionists than Herzl himself. They are more Zionists than us, pushing this narrative, unfortunately, forward. And you had MBC, the Middle East Broadcasting channel, funded by Saudi Arabia from the UAE, pushing, instead of talking about the Nakba, talking about the war for liberation, independence of the state of Israel, showing documentaries that was pushing the Zionist narrative forward. This is at this level. Looking at the governmental level, and unfortunately, Sisi is more of a Zionist, sometimes you see, than Netanyahu. Netanyahu has blocked and sometimes allowed aid into Gaza, yet Sisi would not allow anything without the permission of the Israelis, and everything has to be checked by them. You have when the Yemenis blocked the Red Sea to Israeli ships, the UAE, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia made an alternative route for them. You can see these governments and these states are part, and actually a part of the Zionist, are Zionist. But you're actually going back. These states were created, states like Jordan and many other states in the region, for the protection of the Zionist state. Jordan has the longest borders with the state, the Zionist state. Not a single bullet was fired from this side over 70 years. And you can see how this is being, unfortunately, pushed forward for the protection of this Zionist state. So all of them, going back to the century ago, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement was made, and then the later development of these Arab nation states, all of them fit in within the Western project, and all of them are part of the protection of this state. And coming to the Abraham Accords, and how this made the deal of the century as the framework. So saying that Al-Aqsa should be divided is the framework for the Abraham Accords. In its essence, it seems it's inclusive, but actually it is exactly the opposite. It is creating creating a new status quo where Israel will have peace with the governments of the states around it, yet the people still resist, and the people will not accept this. Going back to the Arab Spring and what took place there, when democracy brought in someone from the Muslim Brothers, the Ikhwan, this was fought by the West, and bringing Sisi. And on the day of the coup, the Israeli newspapers read Sisi, the hero of Israel, because when Mohammed Morsi was in power, when Gaza was attacked in 2012, he immediately opened all the borders with Gaza. He sent his prime minister into Gaza, and you can see this was a threat to them. So you have to get rid of him, topple him, bring in a general that is a strategic treasure to Israel, as he is called. Mubarak was called that before, and Sisi the same with him. Going back to the burning of, I keep going back to lots of examples, the burning of Al-Aqsa in 1969 and the establishment of the OIC. The first summit of these nations, the Islamic nations, came in Rabat in Morocco, and it was later leaked. The king of Morocco gave full access to the Mossad, to all the sessions, to make sure that nothing will be done against Israel. So you can see these states in their core are Zionist and part of the Zionist project, and they will keep until these governments are toppled. Maybe another spring is needed to get rid of these corrupt governors. They're not even statesmen. They're representing both the Western and the Zionist project in the region.
There's a lot to digest, and I think one of the things to reflect on, we recently had a protest staged at the Egyptian embassy here in Pretoria, yes, calling on Egypt to open Rafah. And some of the pro-Egyptian comments that we heard online was that Egypt doesn't have control over Rafah, it's Israel who controls Rafah. But you've just given the example of Mohammed Morsi, may Allah have mercy on him, who had opened the borders. So Egypt does have control over the border. It's just that they do the bidding of the Israeli state, of the Zionist state. So much so that when Palestinians need to leave Gaza, they have to apply for leave, and their names get sent to Israel, which then approves or declines those requests. In addition to, it's well documented, the bribes that have to be paid by Palestinians to leave Gaza to the Egyptian business people who are closely linked to Sisi's government at $5,000 per adult. So Egypt does not have an excuse. Egypt does not have any excuse because it was done before.
Yes. And the same, you have these protests across in Turkey, in the UK, across all embassies in Germany, and the Egyptian government is not willing, unfortunately, to take this because they are going back. They are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. And not just with Palestinians leaving, even the aid going in before 70 days ago when the borders were completely sealed. Before that, even the aid would come to Rafah, sent by all these Muslim states. They would come to Rafah, then be sent down to Mabar Abu Salim, to the crossing, checked by Israel. They'd get rid of what they do not want, sometimes 60%, sometimes 40%, sometimes 50%, sealed, and it goes back to the Rafah border again. And then per truck, $10,000 have to be paid to the Egyptians, sometimes worth more than the aid that is going in. And a lot of the charities would pay this. The Jordanians did the same. This was just leaked a few days ago. The king of Jordan, he was dropping aid into Gaza. For every time he did this, they were receiving $400,000 bare drop, more than the what was being dropped, and they were being dropped in wrong places, killing people in their tents as they fell over. And you can see the complicity of these states. Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, unfortunately, and even North African states, and amongst others, they are complicit in this genocide. They are part of the problem just as much as the Israeli government is a problem.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anything more despicable than to actually profit, literally profit off a genocide. And you call yourself, you want to associate yourself with Islam and Muslims, and you want to champion yourself as a savior of Islam, or as a figure of Islam and a Muslim leader, but yet you take money on the backs of, not on the backs, on the torn limbs of Palestinian children and of martyred women and men. It's absolutely despicable. Dr. Khalid, my last question to you on that is this: what we've been talking about this evening, Zionism is undoubtedly a cancer within the Muslim world and within the broader world, because, and it's a discussion for another time, the Zionist influence that's taking place outside of Muslim lands, and the problems it's causing through various parts of the world. How do we combat this? What are your thoughts? How do we go about within the Muslim world and then within the wider world? Because a cancer, if it's left unchecked, it's just going to grow and grow and grow, and it's going to eat everything in its sight. How do we go about dealing with this cancer? The Tufan al-Aqsa was something that, through Allah's mercy, opened the eyes of the world to what this cancer actually is. And it's come at an immense cost of life. How do we go about? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, this is a very difficult question, but as you have mentioned, I think the world is waking up to what is happening. And since the 7th of October, since the flood of Al-Aqsa, the world is not the same again. And you have a lot of changes in society. Even in Germany, more than 60% of young people, where you're not even allowed to speak on Palestine, more than 60% of young people do not see Israel as a legitimate state. Things are going in the right direction. The same with American young people. This is changing. The more pressure that they put, but they are, to just give hope, the Zionist project, this Zionist Western project, is in its last leg of its existence. And this is why they are fighting so hard to make it survive. And you heard Netanyahu, this is way before the 7th of October, talking to rabbis that he will make sure that Israel will see a century, because they know, and there are prophecies amongst Jewish religious circles that this state will not survive 80 years. And they talked about the curse of the 80 years. So just to give hope, this is the end of the Zionist project. The question is, to your audience and to everyone listening, what will your share be in ending this cancer and in stopping this genocide? I think raising awareness is the most important. And I think the Zionists make our job much easier. In them, the way they destroyed every mosque, every church, every university, hospital, they're wiping everything out and they're bragging about it. And I think the world has finally seen the real face of this Zionist monster in this land. Yet every country has to develop a strategy. I think for South Africa, a strategy needs to be developed. For Turkey, for the Western world, for the United Kingdom, for Germany, for every place, those who are along the same page need to come together and develop a strategy. This strategy should entail a number of things, from boycott at the state level of both economic sanctions. We're not talking about this. We're just talking about cutting off. Still South Africa supplies the coal to Israel, and through Turkey, Azerbaijani oil is giving the lifeline. We are still supplying this genocide. We need to stop it in its tracks in our own circles and our own countries to make sure that this does not continue. And I think this is the first step. During the South African apartheid, this was the movement of the people, and you saw this in the United Kingdom. Boycott of their goods was the main driving force that eventually, together with the resistance and the support for the resistance in South Africa, is what brought it. And I think we already have a blueprint that we can work towards. And these ideas that I'm mentioning need to be developed within each country's context. Both the diplomatic isolation, completely cutting all ties. We've been talking about this for decades. It hasn't been implemented. The only time it was implemented was in the 70s when King Faisal cut off the oil to the West, and this eventually he was assassinated by his own nephew. But to teach others a lesson that you should never do this. I think there needs to be a revolution across the whole of the Muslim world. And this cannot take place without knowledge. Knowledge is the base of this revolution, both in the Muslim world and also across the Western world. We see how this international system has failed. It has failed. The United Nations has failed. South Africa is still pushing in the ICG, and it's commended what is being done there, and it exposes the Zionists. Whether we achieve our goal of arresting them or not is something else, but the idea of taking them to court and exposing them is very important. Academic boycott is extremely important. Grassroots activism is extremely important. The change in the media discourse. And I think today the media is still controlled by the Zionist narrative. You see BBC, you see the CNN, yet there is some breakthrough, but it's very, very difficult. And this is why alternative media is very, very important. I think what you're doing is important in this regard, in this podcast and in other activism that is being pushed both by yourself and people in South Africa. However, recently I was in Ireland. I traveled to Germany, to England, to Scotland, and you see there is a big shift. You see this shift even in the United States. Jews are speaking out against the genocide. Muslims are speaking out against the genocide. Christians are speaking against this genocide. Not only that, even LGBT aren't accepting this. And when you look at this, the reason people aren't accepting this is because of our humanity. There's still a sense of humanity in our hearts that does not accept this. But for the Muslim, this is an issue of your iman, your faith. And I think for a Muslim, you need to work double the work that anyone else is doing, because for you, this is an issue of humanity, but at the same time, an issue of your faith. Also, which is very crucial, your future depends on it. Your future depends on this, because particularly the states that are surrounding this Zionist cancer, as you put it, are directly under threat. You see them extending into Syria, into Lebanon, into Yemen. This would not stop. This idea that we're going to have this promised land extending from the Euphrates to the Nile, going into Egypt, going into all these places. This is a threat to your future, beside it being an issue of your iman, beside being an issue of your humanity. And I think, as Allama Iqbal has said about a century ago, after every Muslim learns La ilaha illallah, they need to understand love. The love of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa needs to be planted in their hearts. Al-Aqsa is the future of the Ummah. And this is, for a Muslim, this state is not the first occupation of this land. At the time of Salah ad-Din, you had the Crusader occupation for 88 years. And it was not the Palestinians that liberated it. And this is something Muslims need to understand. The Ummah has to come together to liberate Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa is the liberation of the whole of the Muslim Ummah. We need to first liberate our minds and then be able to liberate the land. This is why knowledge is extremely. Why is Al-Aqsa part of my iman? Why should I defend Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa? Are very important question every Muslim needs to be asking. And this state will, by Allah, the will of Allah, will end. And the future of the Ummah is associated with this land. And let me say, as a Palestinian, I do not want Jerusalem to be the capital of a future Palestinian state, Eastern Jerusalem. I want Bayt al-Maqdis, as Rasulullah said, to be the future capital of the Ummah, the whole of the Ummah, from east to west. This will be not just for Palestinians, not just for Muslims. This is where Islam will rise again. And everyone, as we started with, Muslims, Jews, and Christians will live in this land, in this blessed land, in this holy land, side by side, under the banner of Islam. And again, this banner will rise again, and it will the peace and prosperity it will create will echo in the rest of the world. And this is why we need a new world order to change this current corrupt order that we are living through.
I think there's no better note to end our program with than what you've just mentioned. The thought of having Bayt al-Maqdis as the center of the Muslim world is something that every Muslim needs to connect to and need to be able to aspire to. Dr. Khalid, I thank you sincerely on behalf of the team at the Unapologetic Muslim and on behalf of our viewers for taking the time out and sharing your expertise and your knowledge with all the viewers. And we hope that inshallah we can have a similar conversation in the near future. Jazakallah khair. We wish you very well.
Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.